Witam serdecznie w imieniu Fundacji biskupa Tadeusza Pieronka i współorganizatorów.
Welcome on behalf of the Tadeusz Pieronek Foundation, as well as the co-organizers of this 23rd conference on the role of Christians in the process of European integration. Let's talk about this year's conference. Consequences of the war. What Europe will be like, what Poland will be like. That's the title of this particular edition. Now, Archbishop Jędraszewski asked John Paul II University to withdraw. So, the foundation that had been founded a year before took over the university's role. Back then, the title was the role of the Catholic Church in the process of European integration. There was a minor change there. Now, the title is the role of Christians in the process of European integration. Cardinal Ryś has said that it was about broadening the formula. You can read it this way, you can also read it differently. Now, why even mention that? Those of you who are regular guests here know that at times we see certain difficulties linked to the organization effort. So you might be asking why we're not in Krzysztofory. Well, thank God nothing's happened. The venue was busy and we found a very friendly and cozy venue here. And I hope that you're going to feel good here. I hope that these 2 days will be interesting for you in this venue. Without further ado, I would like to invite the co-organizers in a moment. First, Andrzej Halicki, MP from the Civic Platform, the co-president of the Polish delegation in the European Parliament with the EPP, and also Mr. Jarubas, who is also the co-president of the Polish delegation. And then Manuel Barrios Prieto from COMECE will be asked to take the floor.
Szanowni Państwo,
hello, welcome. I'm really happy that we are here together. This is a very important moment, and the title of this conference is equally important. I believe that there was a question there. The formula has been evolving and all that. So to respond to that, let me thank the foundation, because the dialogue is ongoing. Now let me talk about the European People's Party, because I'm representing it at this moment. I'm wearing this hat. This is a very important dialogue, because we're talking about the role of Christians that is played in the current public space, but also the essence, that is, the role that we play in this changing Europe. Nothing is going to be the same. Nothing is going to be the same as it was before the Russian invasion on Ukraine. The Europe will be a new Europe, and we are looking at a number of challenges. They're going to be discussed here at this conference, and these are new and fundamental challenges. Fundamental not only for us, for Poland, the whole community. The social structure has been changing dramatically. It'll continue to change. Well, there is some kind of impact that results from the crisis. You know, the pandemic started it all. The health security is another factor. Our security, that is the issue of borders, controls on said borders, not only and the border of the EU, but also within the EU itself, because certain things don't work the way they should. So these are the challenges that we are looking at. What we need to find is not only a response, but also we need to make sure that Poles make a creative part of this process, that we are constructive in this process, and that ultimately we do something that Europe is already used to. What do I mean? Well, solidarity, John Paul II. It is all thanks to us, thanks to Poland. We triggered this incredible change that was finalized in 2004. Well, the beginning was, the end of 80s, the beginning of 90s. So today, the challenge is similar. This could be another decade of great changes, and it might result in a completely different Europe. Possibly in the 30s, this community will be much more numerous. There will be 10 plus states. Possibly, the West will not dominate the community anymore, both in terms of numbers and in terms of this mental and cultural plane. But let me begin again. So our party, the Christian democracy in Europe, and us as parts of this major puzzle. Mr. Jarubas leads PSL. Both of us, we guarantee that we will continue to support these conferences. We will co-organize them and co-finance them. After all, we believe it is important for communities, for milieux to meet. It is important to have this constructive dialogue involving also difficult questions. This dialogue is very much needed. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the organization of this event. Let me say, well, see you in a year, but for now, have a very successful conference, interesting 2 days, and continue to act, please.
Szanowni Państwo, czcigodni
Gentlemen, fathers, clergy, the organizers, I'm representing myself and my leader, Mr. Kościół-Europa, the president of PSL. Let me congratulate the foundation because you continue this work. This is the 23rd of this conference, and it's a kind of a heritage of Bishop Pieronka, a great person. For us, for our party, these meetings are very important because here difficult questions can be asked. Andrzej Halicki, my colleague, has already mentioned that. There is this great admirer and promoter of this conference in Strasbourg, Jan Olbrycht, and we often talk together, and he makes us sensitive to that. He, as Andrzej Halicki has just said, this is the conference that is worth supporting. Now, Mr. Halicki said that integration is a process that is happening before our eyes. Jean Monnet once has said, the European Union is developing not despite crisis, but thanks to crises. Such moments as pandemics or the war is the best possible moment to pose the right questions. Where to go? Which areas we could be more sensitive to as the European Union? We are talking about the Europe's autonomy. We're talking about health and military security, digital security, food security. There are a number of such areas that are quite important. We know that single countries cannot respond sufficiently to these challenges. We need a larger cooperation, and we need to work on that. There was this important project that the EU started, the Conference on the Future of Europe, an unprecedented undertaking. For 2 years, there have been a number of panels and meetings with citizens and young people, and there we talked about the EU and how better it could respond to the needs of Europeans. Let's talk about our dimension, the Christian dimension, our responsibility for these processes. I believe that we should not surrender. We have founding fathers that stem from this foundation, Christian Democrats, great Europeans that, after the war, shaped the EU as we know it today. But also, we have this everyday responsibility for the formation of this project, and the institutional church also plays a role. It has certain responsibility, and now we see this process of polarization. It's becoming increasingly difficult to talk to one another, and in this moment, the church should be the moderator of this discussion. It should not allow what we sometimes see, namely that we do not talk to one another. Have a successful conference, ladies and gentlemen. May this idea continue. As Andrzej has said, let us meet here next year, and may we be even more numerous. I wish you a very successful conference.
I will speak in English. So first of all, cordial greeting on behalf of COMECE, the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Union, of which I am the Secretary General. It's, I think, the fourth time I come to this conference here in Krakow, and we are a long-standing partner of this conference, which offers an important space for dialogue between politics, academia, media, the church, as has just been said, broader civil society, on issues regarding the role of Christians in the process of European integration. This year's edition of the conference is dedicated to a theme that worries us all: the ongoing tragic war of aggression in Ukraine and its wide-ranging consequences for the European Union, its member states, as well as its citizens and communities, including the communities of faith. At an audience with Pope Francis in March this year that we had as COMECE, as the Commission of the Bishops' Conference of the European Union, the Holy Father highlighted in his address to the bishops of COMECE two dreams. Pope Francis, I think this also was the spirit in St. Pope John Paul II, this idea of dream, of having a vision that leads us towards a future. Pope Francis spoke in his meeting with us of two dreams that he considers particularly important and urgent for today's Europe. One, the dream of unity. And we just heard of this important question about the enlargement of the European Union and the unity between us, of different member states, different cultures, different peoples. Another dream, the dream of peace. This was an initial dream of the founding fathers of Europe: create peace in a continent that has been torn by so many wars. Building upon the vision of St. John Paul II that said, Europe is called above all to rediscover its true identity. This was a cry, a shout of John Paul II in a city that is very dear to me, the city of Santiago de Compostela. There John Paul II cried out, Europe, rediscover yourself. So Europe is called above all to rediscover its true identity as a community of reconciled nations open to others with creative fidelity. And this is a very important concept, creative fidelity to the fundamental values. Pope Francis underlines the need of a true Europe that acts as a bridge and a peacemaker in its neighborhood and in the world. So at this historical juncture in which we are, after decades of having taken peace for granted in our continent is once again plagued by a major violent conflict. Pope Francis asks us all to recover the European spirit, and this is another important concept on which as Christians we can contribute a lot, the European spirit. And I think all of us, when we travel, we go to other places, other regions of the world, maybe in having dialogue with other cultures, other peoples, we discern this European spirit, which has to do with the dignity of the human person, has to do with the concept of community. Once that enables us to look beyond our own times, beyond national boundaries and immediate needs, and that generates forms of diplomacy capable of pursuing unity and not aggravating divisions. In this respect, the Pope also addresses an appeal to the Church. Her task should be to form people. He told us this to COMECE in the audience we had with him in March. Ask Church to form people that are able to read, to discern the signs of the time, and who know how to interpret the European project today and tomorrow with creative fidelity. Women and men that are both architects and artisans of peace. Women and men that even in times of war have the courage to think with the logic of peace and that do not cease to seek creative efforts for peace. In this sense, a friend of mine mentioned in an email that he wrote to me some words of a very famous person, a pastor that died, that was an activist against Hitler, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a famous theologian as well. He said, something new can be born that is not discernible in the alternatives of the present. I think this way of thinking and hoping has inspired many peace processes, like the principles of the Helsinki Final Act and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. This idea that something new can be born that is not discernible in the alternatives of the present. This was also the spirit that inspired the founding fathers of the European Union. We have also to keep in mind what is happening, and we have seen yesterday, these photos of this exodus of the Armenian people from Nagorno-Karabakh. So you know that the Armenian people are very dear to us. We share the same faith. So we keep this in mind in our meeting and in our prayers. Another shared commitment to be carried by all politicians, academics, media, representatives, religious authorities and citizens also present here in this meeting is that of responsible communication. A very important issue. Very important issue. Communication is an essential way to experience human fraternity and to build community, to describe our experiences, and thus to create historical memory and contribute to the understanding of events, to the way we interpret what is happening. And yet, in today's fast-changing world of communications and digital systems, we are unfortunately also witnessing an increased spread of disinformation. Before it was said polarization, and this is fueled by misinformation. Twisting the truth in pursuit of certain particular interests to influence political decisions or to advance economic goals. Pope Francis calls these tendencies a tragedy that discredits others and foments conflict by inciting intolerant attitudes and spreading arrogance and hatred. According to the Holy Father, the best antidote to falsehoods are not strategies, but people. People who are ready to listen, to have a true dialogue, to make efforts to engage in sincere understanding of the other so that truth can emerge. In this way, communication becomes a real means of promoting goodness, generating trust, and opening the way to communion and peace. So, dear friends, thank you very much for the invitation of COMECE 1 year more to be part of this conference. And I look very much forward to our discussions and to think together, here also as Christians, on our contribution to renewing the European project in this moment, with quite a few challenges, helping Christians to rediscover their important role in this process of further advancing the European integration. Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa,
Ladies and gentlemen, In spring this year, I visited Archbishop Ryś, and we spoke about the conference this year. Archbishop Ryś told me at that time, unfortunately, I'm not able to visit you. I wish I could, but unfortunately, I am not able to visit you in person. If you want to, I can be with you online. I can prepare a recording. If you want to, I can write something for you. And then we said goodbye. When in summer I found out that Archbishop Grzegorz Ryś has become cardinal, I was happy because he became cardinal and that he'd be able to visit us also. Why? Because cardinals do not have to ask for permission, they have to ask the bishop, the local bishop, for permission to be there. But unfortunately, well, Cardinal Ryś is today in Rome at a very important celebration, but he has chosen to prepare a recording for us, an introductory statement for the conference this year. Ladies and gentlemen, 42 minutes with Cardinal Grzegorz Ryś ahead of us.
Dzień dobry wszystkim, szczęść Boże. Przepraszam, że nie mogę być osobiście.
Good morning. The Lord be with you. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you in person. I have been called to go to Rome, and I've decided simply to prepare a recording for you. I've been asked to prepare a short statement on Christians in the war and the idea of just war, a very broad subject, would require perhaps a book. There have been a number of books already prepared on that, but nevertheless I've decided to focus on four most important areas. It's not going certainly to be a synthesis, it's not going to be in any way a full lecture devoted to the subject of Christians in war. I would like to focus on four most important issues that might be hopefully inspiring for you in your discussions later on. Can I start perhaps with a text that I like to read? It's called The Life of Saint Martin of Tours. Fairly unique text describing the life of one of the medieval saints. The first version comes from the year 396, just a year before the death of Martin of Tours. It looks like Sulpicius Sever. Actually, the author has presented the first version of this text to Martin himself, that he actually, Saint Martin was able to review actually the first version of the text devoted to his life. Well, I speak about it not to mention or not to say that Martin was not a humble person, but simply this is a text that was written at the time when Martin was still alive, so it's not really a legend but a true story of his life. In this document, in the fourth chapter, we've got reference to the events of the year 356. I will just read a short excerpt. At that time in Gallia there were barbarians entering, and Caesar Julian at Wormatia decided to collect his troops and start to pay his troops. And according to the tradition, everyone was called by name, and then Martin was also called upon. And then he decided that it was the right time to actually ask to be released from military service, because he believed actually he should not receive any money if he had no intention to continue his military service. I've been serving you, he addressed the emperor. I would like to serve God now. Please give your money to someone who's going to fight. I am the warrior of Christ, not allowed to fight in the military service. And then the emperor said that perhaps you fear the battle that was coming, that was going to be held next year, not for the next day, the religious reasons. And then Martin still said, and he was even more determined, he said, if you believe that I am a coward, it's not because of faith reasons. I will stand in front of the warriors without any weapons, under the name of Jesus Christ, without a shield or without a sword. I will just walk across the enemy lines. And then Caesar actually told him to be there, kept there, and to make sure that he would be there unarmed, without any weapons, standing in front of the barbarians. But on the following days, actually, the enemy sent their envoys asking for peace, giving themselves and their property to the emperor. Who could have any doubt that this was actually the victory of blessed Martin, so that he would not have to participate in the fight without any weapons? Jesus Christ certainly would not be able to give any other victory to his warrior, other than that the enemies decided to surrender. Nobody was killed, no blood was shed. A unique text, not very often actually referred to, a very important episode. At that time, the more popular episode is about the poor man he meets and cuts his cloak into and shares with him. That's a different episode that shows a war. The barbarians actually were the invaders in Gallia, and this was a war that seemed to be a just war, defensive war. Martin not only has the right to, but we could perhaps say that actually he had a duty to participate in this defensive war. It was his 26th year in the army. He's a well-experienced soldier in the unit that he represented, but still he, let us remember, already for 2 years he had been a Christian. He had been baptized, and Sulpicius Severus at that time, he said that he did not give up actually his service. Yes, you know that he was asked by his military leader to stay, but he decided to stay, but only in a formal way after being baptized. This reference shows to us this tension, internal tension in Martin, that on the one hand he became a Christian, on the other hand he still was a soldier and was paid and made his living as a warrior. This tension, I think, is very well also to be found in this reflection of Sulpicius Severus. If the emperor was to be, if God was to stand on the side of the warrior, he had to make sure, of course, that no blood would be spilled. What is difficult, of course, or impossible to reconcile, is to be a Christian and at the same time to spill blood. This is something that, of course, cannot be reconciled. Let me also refer your attention to this phrase that Martin wants to be the warrior of Christ, Milius Christi. This is a very important phrase that became even more popular later in the Middle Ages. I will go back somewhat later to this phrase. Also, you can refer to some icons, mosaics of the past. Jesus Christ presented as a warrior with a banner, with a you can see it, for instance, in the mosaics in Ravenna. So we are starting here from this reference here and this picture of a warrior who knows that he is not supposed to spill any blood, and his this function cannot actually be reconciled with the faith and with the baptism that occurred earlier. Where does it come from, actually? This, I think, can be found in the earlier practice of the ancient church. Martin dies in the 4th century, but he's a typical medieval saint. Those borders between the different historical epochs sometimes are very difficult to draw. But this ancient tradition can be found in the text written by the Hippolytus of Rome. Apostolic tradition is the title, and there is the text from 215 in the main principles related to the way in which adult men and women were prepared to be baptized. We can read there that a soldier who wants to participate in this process of preparation, we have to tell him very clearly that he should not kill anyone, even if he were to receive such orders. If he did not want to agree, he would need to be sent back, because both those who prepare for the baptism and also the believers who would like to join the army, they should be told to leave, because such a decision would be showing disdain towards God. if someone is baptized, let us remember this was the beginning of the 3rd century AD. So those who have been baptized are prepared for baptism. If they want to be soldiers at the same time, they have to change their decision, because being a soldier, if they were to become warriors, this would be a way in which actually they would act counter to the will of God. Well, if you take a look at the 20th century documents, Magistra Ecclesia, very clearly you can see there information that someone who actually serves in the army serves for the protection of their country, and these are good deeds. So today, actually, Christians can be soldiers, warriors, but the first original tradition of the 3rd century or the early church, as you can see, it was very much different. It was much more radical at that time. And of course, this tradition, to put it in simple terms, perhaps pacifist tradition, as you might perhaps call it, if you were to read to the so-called penitent books prepared on the British Isles in early 6th century, and later over the next following centuries they were prepared, of course, not only on the British Isles, but St. Charles Borromeo also was an author of similar books. In those penitent books there is always information that if someone kills someone, even in the case of a war that is a war of defense based on some authority that considered it a just war, still you have to make amends, and there is a need to do between 40 days and half a year when you had to balance and be part of that.
Talk about the sources of such reflection. You need to look for them in the Gospel itself. 3 sentences now. Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount there, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who introduce peace, for these are going to be called the sons of God." And then, do not resist evil. If somebody strikes you in your right cheek, show him your left cheek. And then love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. We know these texts naturally. It would be hard not to. They come from the most important speech made by Christ. But we may not, all of us, realize the significance of the time and the context in which these sentences were written down. Now, Matthew's text is the Greek text. This is what we have access to. It was written down at the beginning of the 70s of the 1st century. It was the first Jewish what was ongoing. It was the rebellion against the Roman occupiers. Now, the finish was quite dramatic because the war continued. So Masada was besieged and taken over, and as you know, the defenders committed a collective suicide. Joseph Flavius actually writes about that because hundreds of those defenders committed suicide. One of the most heroic, you might say, events in the history of Israel. This is what we read in writings of Flavius Josephus. So, we are reading those invocations to love your enemy, not to resist evil. All of that is set in a certain context, the context of war, in the defense of its own independence, and it's a reaction to Rome having ruled the land of Israel for a century, for 100 years or so. So this is quite a dramatic context. And this is when these words are written down. And this context gives a different, weight to those words. This is not a theoretical reflection. It is not. These are words spoken in a certain historical context. So these are the first two images. We've got Martin of Tours and the justification of his stance. Mind you, for a long time it would be understood for the Church. We can read it in the penitentiary documents. So it would be understood in this way well into Middle Ages. And yet, before Martin's life and death, we see the beginning of a different tradition, a different line of reasoning. Usually people pope to this decision, it was the year 1314. Deserters, soldiers that desert the army, were to be excommunicated. So a year after the Edict of Milan, a certain principle in the Church is formed, namely that soldiers must not desert. Usually people explain it the following way. After all, the situation of Christians in a state changed completely. Until recently they were minority. Yes, they were still a minority, and yet up to a point they lived in Rome by necessity. They had nowhere to flee. They were internal migrants, if you will. No, after the Edict of Milan, the situation started to change, because then Christians started to contribute to the creation of the state, and they had to carry the burden of responsibility to some extent. You could point to texts from the 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd century where popes discuss their responsibility for the state, even though that said state is led by an emperor that persecutes them. But here the situation changes completely. This state is going to be increasingly Christian, so Christians are the first ones that should take responsibility for that state. And this is, in this light, should you read this edict on soldiers being excommunicated if they deserved. So this profession, that of soldiers, is now accepted as something worthy. And not only is this profession now praised, but also it is turned into something increasingly sacred. Another good example that's going to show that process. It's a rite that we know, mid-10th century, this is when it happened for the first time. It's the rite of the blessing of the sword, or the blessing of arms in general. Now, for the generation of Martin of Tours, this rite would be rather shocking. At first it was quite simple in its form. You had a knight, a soldier, they would put the sword on the altar for the knight while he would pray. And in the morning they would collect, or he would rather collect, this sword that by then would have been changed. But then you had certain written prayer forms. Let's stick to the Polish sources after all. This is where we are in Poland, so there is this pontifical of Kraków, mid-19th century, the oldest document of this type here in Poland from the history of the Polish Church. And there we have two prayers. Benedictio super vexillum is the first time, the blessing of the flag, and the second one, Benedictio armorum, the blessing of arms. Interestingly, you find them right after the consecration of a Christ, the consecration of a church, rather, of a church. So these are the most important ones. Then come the ones that I've mentioned, and only then, which is also important, do you see the rites related to various orders, vows, the higher vows and lower vows. You can read even how the Bishop of Rome is ordained. So you have those two prayers. and they have quite a special character. You know, it's a bit like vesture. Because here it is a bit similar to what happens when a member of the clergy puts on their gown. So here you see that this knight also begins to play a role in church. Benedicta Fedebedexilum is linked to the wars of Abraham, especially the war against the 5 kings, and to David's battles. Mind you, we see links back to the Old Testament rather than the New one. Because in the Old one you can find the allusions to holy wars that are waged, and basically people are encouraged to do so by God. Here you have those spears and the shield and the armor, the sword, and in a fight the one who wields them must not suffer any physical or spiritual wounds. So there is this conviction that if you wage a war, participate in a war, it's a risk to your soul. And this is why you see this benediction. This blessing is supposed to protect you from this particular kind of destruction that may happen internally. Now the second pontifical, the one from Plock, 12th century, there only the flag is blessed, when benedictio vexiri. There you also have some kind of tension. On the one hand, you have this request for a flag to be blessed, and mind you, it's a special flag. It is to be used by soldiers. They're not going to hold it somewhere in a palace. It is meant to be used to wage war. At the very end, you read that God is the one that destroys wars. God does not win wars. So the Christian God does not win war, but rather God's objective is to do away with the war, to finish the war. It's a paradox there. You have this God that is interested in destroying the war. At the same time, we are asking said God to bless the flag that we want to use during a war. So again, it's a certain right, a bit like vesture, and Miles Christi notion returns here. We read it in the life of Martin of Tours. So here, this notion is used differently. It's not somebody who leaves the profession, but rather who continues to pursue this profession, and he is still a warrior. He does not set the sword aside, does not reject arms, but rather this soldier of Christ, understood in this way, will continue to use the sword, but as a servant of God. So here, this military function is considered worthy, and leads us to another notion, that of a just war. As always, St. Augustine is the precursor, and he writes, just wars are those that are a retribution for injustice. A very broad definition here, coming from St. Augustine. It can open up a certain longer process whereby we would make this definition more precise. And let's look at how we defined it in Poland in the 15th century. Here in Kraków, we had the Polish School of the Law of Nations, or International Law, and we are quite proud of that because it's our important contribution to the history of universal thought. Two opinions here. Stanisław Skarbimierz, the first rector of the restored University of Kraków. The second one is of Paweł Włodkowic, Paulos Wladimiri, and we, all of us Poles, are quite proud of him. Now, Stanisław Skarbimierz, you might believe that a war is just if it is waged to regain property or in defense of your country. If you fight of necessity to renew peace that has been disturbed or to reach that peace. If it is not waged because of greed or hatred, if it is waged by authority of a monarch or of the church. And another quote from Stanisław, you see the remnants of this original pacifist tradition. The members of the clergy should not start wars that lead to the spilling of blood, but rather they should suffer so that their own blood is spilled for Christ, so that in action they can imitate what they do at the altar. That is why Christ says, sheathe your sword, and he says it to Peter. Here we know who must not wield swords. The clergy must not do that. So you had this original idea that a Christian is not supposed to wield swords, but there is still a group that must not do that. These are the clergy. The clergy must not fight, must not spill blood. And you could see that somebody was a member of the clergy because they never had weapons on them, which was universal at the time. Now, if a candidate has spilled blood, it would be an impediment to becoming a priest. While they were and still spilled it, they would not actually be able to do their duties.
Jeszcze jedno ze Stanisława.
Another quote from Stanisław, perhaps of Skarbimierz. He spoke about an unfair, unjust war. He said that those who begin such unjust war, they are responsible for all the harm that has been done on those who have been attacked, but also all the harm of their own people. So both sides of the conflict, in a way, they can make their claims, try to have their harms leveled against or vis-a-vis the person who starts an unjust war. Still, Paweł Włodkowic of Poland. Here, we've got a number of elements, a list of 5 elements that have to be fulfilled to have a just war. The person, actually, a lay person, not a priest, very important. Then the very subject. It should be about regaining freedom or the good of one's homeland. Then the next point is about the reason. There has to be a need, you have to fight or to fight for peace. Then the spirit, not because of hatred or revenge or greed, but for love, justice, obedience, because to fight, it's not a sin, but what certainly is a sin is to fight because of greed. And still an authorization of the church if you fight for faith or the monarchy, if you fight for your homeland. So in the medieval societies, and the authorities are very important, those that can be called upon, the authority of church or the authority of the monarchy. And again, fighting in defense of faith, as Włodkowic said, it's not a fight that should be also equal to the spread of faith of Christianity. The whole Polish school of Law of the Nations is about the possibility to have pagan allies in what is a just war. You can fight actually together with pagans if you fight for a good cause. Włodkowic also said that you can speak about just war, but not a war to spread faith, but to very clearly fight for your own, or keep your own property. But he believed, again, very clearly that the Holy Land is the property of Christians. For this reason, he believed that crusades were examples of just wars. Again, very clearly, fighting in defense of faith is not about actually Christians getting together, picking up their weapons to fight someone who persecutes Christians. So again, very clearly, the 5 elements that I mentioned, I think this is the very core about the science of what just war is. Again, the person, reason, the subject or the motive, the spirit and the authorization. There has to be an authority behind the very concept of the war. And this concept of just war, it's going to, I think, be with us as long as this formula of the European society is with us, the one we call Christianitas. Do we still have Christianitas in Europe? We could pose this question, of course, in the world that has been described by the author del Sol. Again, there are different translations of the title, La fin de la chrétienté, the end of the Christian word, describing the situations relating to the different structures and the changes that we have, how this model that used to be universal in Europe, it is perhaps coming to an end now. This is again a subject perhaps for another discussion for us. But still, all those who are very much attached to this concept of Christianitatis, also to this idea of the definition of just war. Towards the end of my speech, I would like to give you a few excerpts of the teaching of Holy Fathers, starting with Francis, Pope Francis, so that we speak here about the most recent texts, the text in which this notion is used, just war. As much as I was able to find it, it's only in Fratelli Tutti, the only text in which I found it, an encyclical from the year 2020. Well, I think it might be interesting to read especially points from 256 up to 262 devoted to the subject we are interested, especially point 258. Pope Francis writes there, it is very difficult today to keep to the rational criteria, those that have been prepared earlier, and to speak about the possibility of a just war. It is difficult to keep those rational criteria that had been prepared earlier in the previous centuries to speak about a just war. Pope Francis does not say here that this concept is not the right one, but he says that today it's difficult to make a reference to those older concepts, to our reality. Maybe it was correct in the previous centuries, but this concept, well, today it's difficult in a rational way still to draw on this, because the context of war and freedom has changed in a significant, unimaginable way, in a terrible way, perhaps also, if you could use this word. If you open this text from Fratelli Tutti, there is change or difference between just war and the reference to also capital punishment there. There is also reference there to both issues, and actually they're discussed together. Both of them have been written roughly in the same spirit. The Pope spoke about capital punishment many times, that there seemed to be no reason to continue with capital punishment in the contemporary world. Also, this concept of just war, he refers to it, that is difficult in a rational way to actually refer to this notion because of the dramatic change of the whole context. The greatest, of course, change is that today one can have a total nuclear war, and what war is today about is would be unimaginable, I think, for people living 100 years ago and before. And the Pope also, in this excerpt from Fratelli Tutti, he writes that, also referring to the Second Vatican Council and also the Constitution on the Contemporary Church, and there's a reference also to the defensive war. He does not question the very notion of defensive war, but he says that it's perhaps used too frequently today. It's overused. There is some manipulation also is being done. Some speak about defensive war, describing what is called preventive wars. Some attack in a preventive way. He says that this is something that should not actually be done. This is not an interpretation that could be considered worthy, and this is certainly an over-interpretation of the text of the Second Vatican Council, in reference to the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. Another text from 2016, in a letter that Francis wrote to Cardinal Clarkson. There was a conference in Rome at that time, and this was devoted to non-violence and just peace. In this letter, Francis writes that the Second Vatican Council, in an explicit way, condemned actually only one thing very clearly. There is a condemnation of war there, very clear condemnation. And again, you can find it in this constitution on the contemporary world, Gaudium et Spes, points 77 to 82. A unique text, in my opinion. If we speak about this subject today's conference, I think it would be interesting actually to maybe print out this excerpt and share it. Without this text, I think it would be difficult, in my view, to understand what has been happening over the last 2 years in the context of the aggression in Ukraine and the words of Pope Francis. I think that words of Pope Francis are very deeply rooted in the teaching of the Council and Gaudium et Spes 77 to 82. And perhaps one more thing. It would be good, I think, also to read the speech of Pope Francis from Hiroshima, the 24th of November 2019. I think the whole speech is worth reading, analyzing. I'd just like to draw attention to one excerpt of this speech, because the Pope writes there that the war is something unworthy, vile, especially because of the nuclear armaments, and using nuclear energy as weapon is something that, as Pope says, this is a crime against human dignity. But then Francis adds that also possession of this weapon is immoral. Possession, let me stress that. This is perhaps against the common way of thinking today. Also those who believe that they respect the Catholic teaching, social teaching, but at the same time are not against the possession. Let me stress it again, not the use, but already the possession of nuclear arms is immoral. These are clear words of Pope Francis. This is difficult to understand, impossible to understand without reading this constitution on the contemporary church in the contemporary world, where there is reference to an arms race and the way in which it is not a real guarantee to make sure that we have peace today. Arms race does not give the humanity any feeling of safety. Again, these are words of the Constitution on the Church in the contemporary world. Very often he repeats those words, saying that each war is a lost war. Each war is a time in which the whole humanity actually loses. In Laudato Si, Christus Vivit, such reference can be found there, especially in Christus Vivit. You can find there information about the terrible consequences of military conflicts for the young people. And at quotation after the Synod of Bishops on the youth, the Pope writes there about what happens to the young people actually who have been part of a military conflict and the terrible consequences in their minds, in their personalities. Not only in the economic sense, but terrible consequences, psychological, spiritual consequences. And still Pope Francis keeps repeating those words. And if I may, still John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, point 17, and the Pope writes there that in Europe, since the end of the Second World War, there was never a true peace in Europe. John Paul II writes about what could be called a truce, perhaps, but not real peace. Lack of war, he writes, is not equal to peace. But at that time, new justifications came up, justifications of war, why war is needed. John Paul II writes about this arms race and the new arms, new weapons, and at the same time you have to find some justifications, usually based on the different ideologies, why actually the arms race is needed, why you need to come up with new arms, new weapons, new concepts to justify war crop up. And here a very important point, point 23, the Pope says that it seemed that the Yaltan order that was set up in Europe by war, that it could be changed only by yet another war, but it actually has been changed not by a war, but by all those peaceful revolutions starting in 1989, or we can go back perhaps to 79, or maybe go back actually into early years, but we speak mainly about the Polish history. But what changed actually the post-war order was this peaceful revolution of the different societies in Central and Eastern Europe, so not a war, but solidarity that actually led to the change in this post-war order. This was the diagnosis of John Paul II in Centesimus Annus.
And another text here we read, not only war, but even the preparation for war is not worthy. The Pope says this is the biggest enemy of the integral development. Integral development, Paul VI talked about that. You have integral development when the whole human being develops and all humans develop. Everybody agrees to that, but then John Paul II says the biggest enemies of this are the preparations for war, that is, armament. John Paul II was actually born to say it. We also read that this arms race is the biggest plague of humanity and an unbearable harm for the poor. And another thought. It is something that we saw when we discussed Francis's writing, that arms race doesn't work. It's not only immoral, it also doesn't work because it is not going to stop the war. Rebenetur hominis. Nobody's going to be surprised here. The world would look completely differently if the money were spent on food rather than on arming ourselves. So, when we look at post-council popes, we see this reflection. And in this reflection, just war, this notion, is questioned to some extent. Every war is a failure, and war can turn into a nuclear war, a total war. And that negates the dignity of a human being. Such a war negates the dignity of a human being. We could look at the documents written by these popes, and we would also find just peace, but the notion of just war, you can see it hardly ever at all. I believe that I spoke too long. Please excuse me. I wish you a very successful conference. All the best.